I welcome everyone to the webinar today focused on the Academy and our denomination and their relationship in the 2020s and beyond. Today, we will think together about the past that has brought together the Academy and the church. And we'll also think forward about what that set of relationships may look like into the future, especially given some of the strains and challenges that certainly our denomination and the larger society are facing in the current moment. So I extend greetings on behalf of the National Association of Schools and Colleges of the United Methodist Church, NASCM, as well greetings from the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, GBHEM. I am Mark Hanshaw, Associate General Secretary for the Division of Higher Education at GBHEM. I do want to welcome a couple of individuals who are in our midst today. First of all, we extend greetings to Greg Berquist, the General Secretary of the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry. Greg, thank you for being a part of this session today. As well, greetings to Sam Hodges, a reporter for the United Methodist News Service. Sam, as well, thank you for being a part of this session. And before we begin, I have just a couple of instructions that might be helpful to all of us as we think about our time together and how best to use it. First of all, our program today will be divided into two portions. In the first portion, our honored guest, William Lawrence, is going to present some thoughts relative to the future of the denomination and the Academy and their relationship. And then in the second portion of this webinar, we are going to invite your questions. And we really want you to offer up any questions that you may have. Because of the large number of people who are participating today, it may be possible that we would not be able to get to all questions. And we apologize in advance for that fact. However, we will collect all of your questions. We will provide them to Bill. And Bill has specifically said that he would like us to provide you with his email address. And so once this session has concluded, we will do that. And I know Bill wanted to be available to any of you who may have follow-up questions that we are not able to touch on during the course of this webinar today. So Bill, thank you for doing that. As well, our session today is being recorded because there was so much interest in this session, and we wanted to ensure that it was available after today to those who might want to see it in the future. So we are going to record and post this session, and it will be available on the GBHEM website under the Resources tab. Likewise, for all of you who have registered today, you will receive a follow-up email, and it will provide you with the link to that recording. And so if you want to view it again, or if you want to share it with friends, you would certainly be welcome to do that. Today, in the second half of our session, as we entertain your questions, procedurally, what I will ask you to do is at the bottom of your screen, you have a button that's marked Q&A. And so if you click on that Q&A button, a side panel will pop up, and there you will have a place where you can type in your question. All the questions will then come to us, and then we will filter them, and I will direct specific questions to Bill in as much as our time allows that he will think about and respond to in the second half of our webinar today. And we, again, will try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. Finally, just as final instructions, once you open that question and answer panel, as you type in a question, there is a place where you can make that question anonymous. And so if you would like to make that question anonymous, feel free to click that anonymous button, and it will come through without any sort of identification to us. So it is now my great pleasure to be able to welcome William Lawrence, former Dean of the Perkins School of Theology. Bill, there is so much that I could say about you as a way of introduction. You've provided leadership to so many important campuses, to Duke Divinity School, Candler School of Theology, Wesley Theological Seminary, and of course, Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. You've played so many roles in the denomination, including service as president of the Judicial Council, which really affords you a very unique perspective. You are a prolific writer. I could just go on and on. But what I am going to do before I turn this over to you is simply offer a personal aside. It so happens that Bill Lawrence came into his position as dean at the same time I was in the midst of my doctoral studies at Southern Methodist University. And it so happens that I think it was during your first year, Bill, that you and I happened to wind up on a plane together, flying to the American Academy of Religion, and engaged in a wonderful conversation about higher education and its future. And let me say, that led to a lifelong friendship. And what I want to say about Bill, because I think this says everything you need to know about Bill, from that time forward, he has remained in communication with me, even though I was a lowly graduate student and he was a dean. He has been interested in my development. He's been interested in my career, and he is truly a friend and mentor. And that is the type of leader that Bill is. And that's the type of leadership he's provided in both the church and the academy. And so, Bill, it is my great, great pleasure to be able to welcome you and say thank you for your participation in this webinar today.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks to all of you for participating in this session. It's a pleasure to be with you, whether it is best to greet you as good morning or good afternoon, or perhaps in some case, good evening. When Mark invited me to discuss with you the future relationship of the Academy and the Church, it seemed to be an opportunity for a really good conversation at a really bad time. Nobody is clear about the relationship between the United Methodist Church and its affiliated academic institutions right now, just as nobody is clear about the future of individual colleges, congregations, and conferences. So somebody ought to talk. And yet the complexities of the conversation abound. An unstoppable pandemic spread by an untreatable virus is causing enormous amounts of suffering and exposing serious doubts about the viability of both for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. Maybe instead of talking, we should simply start singing country music. One country fan, our former colleague in higher education, Jerry Campbell, especially liked the lyric, quote, "I'm so confused I can't decide whether to kill myself or go bowling." But even in our confusion, we can still talk. Besides, even before COVID-19 was a name for a disease that threatened our institutions, we were in the midst of another crisis, and it is still with us. Our disputes over the inclusion of LGBTQ+ persons are bitterly divisive. The likelihood is that a schism will soon split the United Methodist Church, and confusion persists about the pieces of the denomination with which any institution might affiliate after a separation. Terrible forces are driving the destinies of academies and churches. It is not clear if the relationship of the academy and the church will be a casualty. So we should talk. But communicating is extremely difficult right now. It is hard to hear amid all the partisan political noise. And it is hard to see any light at the end of a tunnel when there are dragons blocking the entrance. So we could find it tough to talk. Obviously, the discussions could be painful and the options awful. And yet having candid conversations and facing challenging choices are what leaders do during crises. To lead is not to react to the moment. To lead is to shape whatever follows the crisis. To lead is to define and design its aftermath. To lead is to honor the mission that is as vital to our future as it has been integral to our past. To lead is to face crises creatively, believing that the present will be redeemed by the promise in which our hopes rest. When I served as a district superintendent 30 years ago, the biblical text that emerged as my favorite was in the New Testament letter to Titus. Though that epistle was traditionally credited to the Apostle Paul, most scholars doubt that Paul wrote it. But far more intriguing than who wrote the letter to Titus is the fact that it is a reply to a letter from Titus that has never been found. Titus had apparently complained about the conditions in Crete, where he had been sent to lead the church. The people of Crete, he wrote, were rebellious, deceptive, corrupt, vicious, brutish, gluttonous, lazy liars. The letter to Titus says, in effect, yes, they are. The unknown author agrees that every harsh adjective Titus used to characterize the people of Crete is true. But then, according to the way the Greek is translated in the King James Version, the author of the letter to Titus adds, "For this cause left I thee in Crete." Let me paraphrase Titus 1:5 for our situation. It is true that things are in a terrible mess right now. That is exactly why our institutions need our leadership. I didn't find this text in Titus on my own. Martin Luther King Jr. preached on the passage at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta in April 1966. In his sermon, Dr. King gave credit to Harry Emerson Fosdick, who had delivered a sermon in 1932 on the same text with the same title, Making the Best of a Bad Mess. Let's put their sermons into their separate contexts. When Dr. King preached about Titus, he was 37 years old. He'd been the voice of justice for a decade. He had mobilized a movement. He had received the Nobel Peace Prize, but his popularity was beginning to slide. His status as the leader of the civil rights effort was under attack. His strong, soothing voice was being overtaken by more strident voices, critical of his methods. His credibility was waning as his opposition to the war in Vietnam was rising. His enemies were increasing, and in 2 years, he would be murdered. When Dr. Fosdick preached about this, he was 52. He preached weekly to thousands from a pulpit at Riverside Church, which John D. Rockefeller Jr. had built for him, and millions more heard him on the radio. But Fosdick faced adversities and adversaries. The fundamentalists said he was so captive to corporate money that Riverside should have the logo of Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company on its tower. New Yorkers were also furious that Rockefeller had built Riverside Church on land that he had cleared by demolishing low-income housing. And the Great Depression had seized New York City. In 1931, the year before Fosdick preached his sermon, 95 patients in New York City hospitals had died of starvation. Near Riverside, people had taken shelter in communities of cardboard and plywood shacks called Hoovervilles that were nicknamed for the president whose leadership had failed them. It was a colossal crisis. King and Fosdick preached on making the best of a bad mess. All life must be tackled as Titus tackled Crete, Fosdick said. What existence hands us is raw material, out of which something must be spiritually made. The situation, said Fosdick, calls for Tituses who will stay in Crete, not content with Crete, not complacent about Crete, but building the better Crete that is to be. People become pastors, professors, and presidents not because our hands are too soft to get soiled or our minds are too meek to face facts, but because somebody sensed we have the capacity to see beyond whatever is breaking at the moment. And right now, lots of things are breaking. Therefore, right now is the time for a vision that sees beyond the ruin, to recognize how we can weld what the past has given us with what the future needs to get from us, and to build what only the eyes of hope and faith can see. From that perspective, and as a prelude to our questions and conversations, I'd like to explore and weave three themes for Methodism and the Academy in this decade and beyond. One, we need to reconsider the terms of a relationship between church and academy. Two, we need to review how academy and church impact public life. Three, we need to realign our resources for our mission in the world. There was a time when our relationship could be defined as a partnership. I was reared in a tiny coal mining town of northeastern Pennsylvania by a loving extended family in a system of public schools at a small Methodist church. The place had ethnic and religious, if not racial, diversity. Our neighbors spoke Polish, Russian, Italian, German, and Welsh. They were Baptists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, ethnically distinguishable Roman Catholics, Orthodox, plus a few Muslims and Jews. Once a year, our little Methodist church had a guest preacher who discussed the importance of our congregation's connections to Methodism's colleges. He particularly emphasized Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, every time he visited. I was a kid. I had no idea where Greensboro was. I was white and had no idea what black colleges were, nor did I know why the letters HBCU would become important. But I learned in church that we were partners with distant, different schools and with local ones like Lycoming. In church, the kids of coal miners and plumbers like me wondered if college might be an option for us after high school. Decades later, as a faculty member at Duke Divinity School, I attended a memorial service in Duke Chapel for Terry Sanford. The service was a big deal because Terry Sanford was a big deal, one of the most important public figures in the South from his generation. At the memorial, family and friends shared stories, one of which involved a trip that young Terry Sanford had taken with his parents in the 1920s when he was a child. From their home in Laurinburg, North Carolina, they traveled to Durham, where the West Campus of Duke University was under construction. Terry's mother told him that the family could never afford to send him to this university, but they wanted him to know that they were Methodists, that this was a Methodist school, and that therefore this actually was our school. Attending it was not as important as being partnered with it. The ironies of history are among the mysteries of life. His mother was right that Terry Sanford would never be a student there. But he did serve for 16 years as the president of the whole place. So Terry Sanford was a Methodist who embodied personally a partnership between academy and church. Now, the church has never owned or controlled Duke, but institutions find ways to partner. Dillard University is affiliated with the United Church of Christ and the United Methodist Church. Ohio Northern affirms its enduring affiliation with the church. Philander Smith is the product of a partnership involving educational needs of former slaves, mission-minded Methodists in Illinois, and Christian leaders devoted to higher education in Arkansas. Simpson College in Iowa partners with the principles of John Wesley. There are many ways to form a partnership, but the issue is not how to link organizations, it is how to engage in mission. In John Wesley's phrasing, the first mission of Methodists is to reform the continent. So the question is not whether academy and church can be structured together institutionally, but whether we can have a relationship that makes a difference in transforming the world. As recently as the 1960s, a Methodist pastor, historian, and Drew University instructor named Fred Mazer, insisted that a greater emphasis upon education by the church made positive contributions to public life. He cited the academic objectivity with which barriers of region and race in the church could be broken. In other words, church and academy can be partners in mission to transform the social order. They can transform the quality of Christian ministry too. Methodist laity began to demand advanced theological education of ministers in the 19th century because they insisted the pulpit had to speak to the problems of the world that the laity in the pews were experiencing. It was laity who built Methodist schools of theology in Boston, in Denver, and in the metropolitan areas of Chicago and New York. In the middle of the 20th century, theological education faced new challenges, and laity came forward again. A Georgia farmer and Emory University trustee named D.W. Brooks promoted a plan for local churches to pay a percentage of the pastor's salary to a fund for future seminarians. An annual conference lay leader in the Northeast asked lay leaders of local churches to collect cash on Laity Sunday for supporting theological education. The 1968 General Conference created a new denominational apportionment called the Ministerial Education Fund for the church to support its academic schools of theology. Partnerships prospered. Academy and church linked at lots of levels in a missional focus upon higher education, not to make more Methodists, but to transform the world. But now the partnership is dying. Huge reductions in the Ministerial Education Fund are coming, and the end of the fund is near. Annual conferences have cut their contributions to colleges and to campus ministries. Academies have built legal and intellectual distance from the church. Consider Southern Methodist University. After the Methodist Episcopal Church South lost control of Vanderbilt, it chose to open two new universities, one on each side of the Mississippi River. Methodists and non-Methodists in Dallas formed a partnership. Local leaders and church leaders found land and money. SMU became an academic unit in 1911. Two bishops laid the cornerstone of Dallas Hall in 1912. Classes began in 1915. The academy and the church partnered in a relationship with ecclesiastical, intellectual, social, and financial benefits that endured through a century of challenge and change. In the reunion of three Methodist denominations in 1939, the university partnered with the South Central jurisdiction. When the jurisdictional conference met every 4 years, it received a report from the university, and it elected trustees for the university. When the university said that its non-discrimination policies included sexual orientation, church and academy respected each other's prerogatives. When the university secured the Bush Library and some objections arose in the church, the partners let the Judicial Council decide. But actions by General Conference in February 2019 to reinforce rigid rules on LGBTQ+ persons made the partnership untenable. The university asked the state of Texas to annul the charter between the church and the academy. The university is now operating as if it did annul the charter. The jurisdictional conference has filed suit in civil court to stop that. A bishop has claimed that he has been wrongly removed from the university board of trustees. As a result, the next jurisdictional conference will not get a university report or receive a list of trusteeship committee nominees to elect to the board. The metaphor of partnership for the relationship of academy and church has been replaced. The current metaphor is power. The relationship between academy and church has become a contest where power is expressed as control. General Conference uses the legislative power of its majorities to try to control sexual identity. Other church bodies use political power to control campus activity. Colleges use curricular power to block clergy and congregations from control of what can be learned or taught. Untenured professors and campus ministers fear donors' desires to control their jobs if they dare to teach that the two creation stories in Genesis are neither historical records nor scientific accounts of how the cosmos came to be. Everybody who has power wants to be in control. Nobody who lacks power wants to be controlled. Yet all of us recognize that in the relationship of the academy and the church, we are living now according to the metaphor of power, but we cannot build a future relationship between the academy and the church on a contest for control. We need a new metaphor. I have one to propose. I suggest that of prophet. I recommend that a future relationship of academy and church be based on the metaphor of the biblical prophet, not as a way to reform institutional ties, but as a way to transform the world. A prophet is not a fortune teller or a future teller, but a truth teller. The biblical ones were very creative in finding fresh ways to tell the truth, particularly telling truth to power. Amos, a tree surgeon by trade, used his gift of rhetoric. Jeremiah performed street theater. Nathan, who was an advisor to King David, used the logic of political science and the language of stories to tell the truth, whether the king wanted to hear it or not. When David complained that he should be living in a grand and glorious palace appropriate to his royal stature, Nathan told him that God wanted him to live not lavishly, but to leave a legacy of justice and safety and freedom for the people. And when David committed adultery with Bathsheba and subsequently, to quell a scandal, had her husband murdered, Nathan used a parable about the theft of a sheep to trap David into condemning himself for his own outrageous actions. When Jesus used parables to expose trick questions like, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus was a truth teller in the tradition of the prophets. When he met Pontius Pilate, he said his purpose was to tell the truth. His disciples said he was a prophet mighty in deed and word because he spoke truth. He told his disciples that truth would set them free. As a prophet, academy and church can make a difference between fear and freedom. The academy and the church can form a relationship with a metaphor of prophet because our different types of institutions are both truth tellers. Each has its own distinctive methods for discovering truth, for publishing truth, and for putting the truth into action. But what we share is a commitment to truth. The church celebrates the truth of Scripture, but United Methodist doctrine also teaches that Scripture relies on additional sources and guidelines for faithful, serious theological consideration. So tradition, experience, and reason are interrelated with and inseparable from one another in Scripture, in discerning truth. The academy, in the arts and sciences, seeks truth. The church needs the academy, and the academy needs the church in order to serve as prophet. The church needs the academy to discern truth through the disciplines of history, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, political science, chemical science, biological science, physical health, psychological health, public health, mental health, climatological health. The church needs the academy to study spiritual experiences and sacred mysteries with the same intellectual rigor that the academy applies to legal norms, cultural forms, corporate practices, and social systems in searching for truth. But the academy also needs the church to discern that truth can set us free, not only when it speaks to scholarly peers, but also when it speaks to ordinary fears. The academy needs the church to show how dangerous it is to ignore the truth, distract from the truth, or finesse the truth. The academy needs the church to say that suppressing truth is not a correctable error in the next lecture, the next article, or the next book. As the Apostle Paul says, suppression of truth is a fatal flaw in human life. In fact, the Apostle Paul defines sin as suppression of the truth. If we know the truth but do not tell it, we suppress the truth. If we recognize the truth but do not deliver it, we suppress the truth. If we discover the truth but consider it politically, financially, or religiously risky to share it, we suppress the truth. Suppressing the truth is sin. In the case of Ahmaud Arbery, the suppression of the video truth about his murder is an evil that is equivalent to the murder itself, according to criminal charges filed. We live at a time when truth is subordinated to political advantage, to economic privilege, to racist tirade, and to sexist outrage. Some suppress scientific truth because they find it inconvenient. Some suppress sacred truth because they want to believe that the gospel favors the prosperous. Some suppress social truth because they insist private wealth is more important than public health. The academy and the church can have a relationship as a truth-telling prophet because the world needs us to tell the truth. The world needs us to discuss marriage in terms of theology, not sexual identity. The world needs us to discuss hydroxychloroquine in terms of chemistry and pharmacology, not political loyalty. For the sake of the world, based on a mission to reform the continents, church and academy can build a relationship to find the truth, tell the truth, and use the truth to set the world free. We need not expend all of our resources to do it institutionally or internally. Indeed, it is far more important that we do it by raising our coordinated voices publicly. Let's not spend our time trying to reform our organizations. Let's transform the world. And we have the resources for this at our disposal. Among my most memorable moments in higher education occurred one day when a donor arrived unannounced at the dean's office door. The purpose of the visit was to hand me an envelope. In the envelope was a check for $250,000 to complete payment on a very large pledge. I barely spoke the words, "Thank you," when the visitor said to me, "No, let me thank you for the privilege of being part of the mission of the school." Neither the church nor the academy will benefit from others' generosity just because there is a denominational symbol on the door or an organizational logo on the floor. Foundations give grants, donors give gifts, and communities value our presence because they are committed to the causes for which we are devoted, the concerns to which we are dedicated, and the truth we are determined to tell. If we have the courage to be prophets, we will get their support. If not, we neither deserve nor will get their support. That also just happens to be the truth.
Bill, thank you so much for those words of wisdom and for that challenge for us to be voices of truth. Indeed, I believe that most of us go into either the work in the academy or work within the denomination because we aspire to be voices of truth. So thank you for challenging us to live up to those individual goals that we may have started our careers with. So Bill, we have a lot of attendees on the line right now. And so what I want to do is extend the invitation to any of you who may have questions for Bill at this point. to please go ahead and add those to our Q&A page. And we have already started seeing some questions arrive. So Bill, I'm going to kick us off with an initial question. And one of our attendees has asked specifically, we being the church and the academy, we sometimes believe that our missions are not aligned and cannot be aligned. And so the question is, how shall churches and educational institutions move forward if it appears that our missions cannot be aligned? Or is there perhaps, and I'm adding this, Bill, is there perhaps a way for us to think creatively about our own missions in a way that does help us to align them? And I think you've sort of already begun to allude to that fact.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to the person who posed the question. Let me suggest, by way of response, three areas for a conversation about this. Number one, it is clear that both the academy and the individual institutions within the academy and the church and the many different forms of ecclesiastical life in the church have different responsibilities and hence are involved in different aspects that can be missionally defined. But if we use the image of a Venn diagram and think not of how those missional expressions are separate, but rather where they overlap, it is very clear there's an enormous overlap. It is certainly true that colleges, universities, theological schools, similar institutions grant degrees. The church does not, and the church cannot and should not aspire to be in the degree granting business. It is also true that in our system, the academies don't ordain persons. That falls to the church. So when the church and the academy are engaged in the education of persons at baccalaureate levels and at master's or doctoral degree levels, the academy is engaged in one aspect of that mission that has a substantial overlap with the church's responsibility in discerning who are properly called and to be ordained. They overlap. They have differences and there are separate areas, but we very much have things in common that we share missionally. And that is part of the platform on which I base this sense that the pursuit of the truth, is a mission that indeed we both share. Sometimes pursuing the same or similar kinds of truth, such as how do you read the opening 12 chapters of the book of Genesis? Sometimes pursuing separate matters.
Thank you, Bill. The next question that we have is lengthy, but I believe that it's important. So I'm simply going to read it, Bill, verbatim, and then you can respond. So the questioner asks this: in my context, the greatest threat to the potential for relationship between the denomination and the college has been the local regional annual conference. There has been a 10-year arc of ignorance about the difference between a Methodist-related college and a Methodist campus ministry. The crux is the fact that the goal of a UM-related campus is not to make more Methodists, but to serve students, faculty, and staff of all and individuals of no religious and spiritual backgrounds. And the fear-driven emphasis of our conference is upon making more Methodists and serving those that we have remaining. In that context, how can those of us seeking to live into the bridge of relationship educate or engage the annual conference leadership on this topic?
Thanks for the question. I need to make some notes about that last part of the question, and then I'll try to respond. All right. I appreciate this question because I think it does help identify and underscore with a particular emphasis some misunderstandings that exist, I am sure, in many annual conferences. Oddly, in some annual conferences that actually have United Methodist related or the United Methodist affiliated campus within the bounds of the annual conference, that has at one point had the kind of relationship in which the conference thought it had and maybe legally did have control of the academy, of the college. So part of the situation we face is that there are certainly understandings which exist, let's say, in the life of an annual conference that may have been correct understandings at one point in the history of the institutions that are simply no longer accurate descriptions of the nature of the legal or affiliative relationship of the institutions. The questioner also importantly distinguished the Methodist related or Methodist affiliated college from the Methodist campus ministry. And I think that is an important distinction, one that's in need of further conversation. I want to get to that in a minute, but I also want to make it clear that there are distinctions within Methodist campus ministries that vary enormously from one academy to another. For example, in some campuses, there is a Methodist campus ministry, let's call the Wesley Foundation. It may be embedded in a more ecumenical campus ministry, but regardless, in which the campus ministry is understood to be subordinate to the campus chaplain. In the case of a university where you may have a university chaplain and a lot of denominational or religiously affiliated campus ministries, some of them report to the university chaplain. Some have no reporting line whatsoever to the university chaplain, but only to their various religious constituencies, ecclesial constituencies, conferences, whatever they may be. That's simply to indicate we live in a richly and robustly diverse environment when it comes to these things. Now, to the question of how to engage in the life of an annual conference on the part of the academy, I have a variety of suggestions that may or may not have been implemented, tried, welcomed, whatever the case might be. But let me offer a couple of points from my own perspective. One, the experience of a number of academies in seeking to be affiliated more closely with or to become more engaged conversationally with the annual conference has sometimes been a function of how receptive an individual bishop may or may not be to such conversations. My suggestion is that although it's certainly important for the academy to develop good relationships with the bishop is not a permanent resident of, nor is the bishop a member of the annual conference. The academy has to build relationships with the infrastructure of the annual conference itself, with the clergy and lay members of the annual conference. And that happens not by simply showing up at district meetings, let alone annual conference meetings, but also by being engaged in the life, the operations of the annual conference. It could be enormously beneficial if more persons in the college, university, or academy life found ways, if they are United Methodists, to become elected as lay members of an annual conference, to volunteer even if they are not United Methodists, to serve on annual conference committees or boards, whereas it is appropriate for non-Methodists to serve. Many United Methodist ministers, pastors of local churches, discover that it is permissible, for example, to have on a local church board of trustees a person who's not a member of the church. That similar position can obtain whether one has a consulting relationship to a conference committee or board, or whether one is a permissible non-Methodist member of a board. The presence at annual conference meetings, district meetings, service on committees of the annual conference become important ways for connections between academy and the church to be established on a personal level, on a participatory level. And I think more of that needs to occur. I also would add, and then let you move on to other questions or clarifications of this one, that it has tended to be a problem in the church across the board. When an annual conference, let's say, is looking at such things as how might we improve curricula for Vacation Bible School or youth ministry, why not turn to the people in the School of Education at a campus? Why not turn to the people in Christian education at a theological school? It is exceedingly rare in my experience for an annual conference to say, we need to have a discussion about the nature and the meaning of the sacrament of baptism. I wonder if there's anybody who teaches the theology of baptism at the college. The college is the last place to which the annual conference tends to turn. And sometimes that happens because the professor teaching it is perceived as too liberal, too conservative, too something. Forget it. It's very important for the annual conference to call on the academic expertise of the persons who are in our midst in the academy.
All right, Bill, thank you. These next two questions are interrelated in that they speak to particular concerns related to our HBCU community. And so let me start with the first. And the questioner asks, what do you say directly to HBCUs and Black Methodist churches in the denomination who are having to respond in the present instance to a crisis within a crisis, a pandemic, and the disease of racism interwoven into the fabric of our society? A disease that has made it difficult to see historically a white denomination as a consistent funding partner or safe space to discuss racism, health disparities, food, and health deserts. African-American theologians and institutions have always had to be prophetic and creative in their handling of injustice in the pulpit and classroom. Is there anything more that we can do?
Thanks again for the question, Mark, and in particular, I'm grateful for this extremely important issue to surface in this webinar this afternoon. One of the reasons that I have come, even at this later stage of my career, to value so much the definition of sin as suppression of the truth, which is from the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans, is that suppression of the truth is a very subtle device that we use in a lot of different forms of life, intellectual, emotional, and certainly we use it in the ecclesial community and the academic community. And the sense in which the truth about the extraordinary difference between the impact of the coronavirus crisis on persons of color as opposed to white persons in the United States, is an example of the truth that has been largely suppressed, except within the communities that are suffering it. Therefore, one of the first responsibilities on the part of the white church is to unsuppress or expose or reveal the truth about what's happening in communities of color, where communities of color are not simply identified by tone of skin or ethnicity, but also by poverty, by the economic circumstances that in many cases plants hospitals based on the economic circumstance of the zip codes immediately surrounding the hospital. Or in a recent example that surfaced in the city of Dallas, where there are, and I'm saying this without having the data in front of me, but I believe there are twice as many testing sites at least north of the interstate highway in predominantly white Dallas as there are south of the interstate highway in predominantly black Dallas. That is unconscionable, but it is an example of how the coronavirus is racialized by these factors. Now, one of the ways to break out of this situation where HBCUs and the church can particularly be partners or collaborators, or better yet, prophets, is for us, for me, to ask that HBCUs not only say this to the Black church community. One of the problems that we have in the church and the academy is that we often tend to talk mostly to people like ourselves. The white church must move aggressively and actively and proactively to hear from HBCUs, to invite faculty, presidents, staff persons, and so forth from HBCUs to speak in white local churches, not at predominantly white annual conferences, predominantly white local churches, in specific enough ways that can say, here's what we need you to do in this white church. Here's the truth we need you to share. Here's what needs to be spread. Breaking down the barriers of race simply to unsuppress the truth about the coronavirus is one of those critically important tasks that we can undertake. It's the responsibility of the church to take the initiative, to go to the Black and brown and Native American communities and say, tell us what we need to know. Tell us so that we can contact the people whom we know in the white community. I'll just end this with an anecdote. It came from a presentation made by one of the United Methodist bishops, now retired, on the campus of Southern Methodist University during the years when I was a dean. The bishop indicated that two United Methodist bishops, now both retired, had gone to see the governor of a particular state and pleaded with the governor to change a statewide policy on a certain matter. And the governor said, there are two of you sitting here. When you can demonstrate to me that there are 20,000 behind the two of you who agree with you, then I'm ready to listen to you. We have to find a way to mobilize all of the church, not just the Black church, but all of the church behind the HBCUs and other academic constituencies in order to unsuppress the truth.
All right. Thank you, Bill. Moving on, the next question that I'm going to refer to you comes from somebody you know quite well, but since we are keeping identities um, anonymous, I won't mention him, but you may, in the question, think about who he is. But he writes, as a Hebrew Bible scholar, I appreciate the use of the prophetic tradition as a model for truth-telling and the partnership between the academy and the church. Where has both academy and church failed given the rampant racism and the killing of Black bodies that has become worse, not better?
Let me ask you just to read the last sentence or so of that question.
Sure. Where has both academy and church failed given the rampant racism and the killing of Black bodies that has become worse, not better?
Okay. I wanted to ask you to repeat that last part of the question because I wanted to make sure the questioner and I were on the same page in terms of talking about the failures of both the church and the academy. Because I think that is a very important observation. Let's go to some things that are simply structural, that we have to acknowledge, although the relationship between the church-affiliated academy and the academically affiliated church are not going to be the environment where these matters can be resolved. But let me just say that for the most part, within the academic environment, the system of rewards, achievements, recognitions, advancements, promotions, and most importantly, tenure, are entirely driven by the agendas of academic guilds. So that academicians are trained emotionally as well as intellectually to speak in the language of academic peers, to write and talk and lecture in a fashion that reaches an academic audience, because that's the audience that's going to provide the primary rating system for determining whether somebody gets tenured or promoted, et cetera. That is a systemic problem that exists and that we in church-affiliated academies simply have to acknowledge is a reality. So part of what I would say has failed on the academic side of the relationship is the failure to recognize that it is tremendously important, not only for the sake of the church academy partnership, relationship, prophetic bond, but also for the sake of the world, that academicians have to learn how to speak the language of the pew, of the church, of the street. And that's because we have to be able to discover a mechanism, a means, devices, methods for communicating with the people who are suffering and dying in the streets. And that is something that is going to require an enormous amount of internal energy on the academic side of this. On the ecclesiastical side, there has been an entirely too strong willingness to accommodate the segregation of the church. I'm sorry, the racial segregation of the church. We're all familiar with the cliches about Sunday morning, 11 o'clock being the most segregated hour. The reality is that segregation, racial segregation, has been built into Methodist life since the founding of Methodism. There were efforts as early as the 1770s in Virginia to adopt resolutions, and in fact, the Flavana Conference adopted an anti-slavery resolution. But every time we tried to deal head on with issues, first slavery, institutionalized slavery, with racial segregation, with separation, as in 1939, by creating a segregated system in order to say that was the price we were going to have to pay for the sake of unity. We in the church have failed. And so we've now created this stratified situation where not only the phrase black church is a phrase that can be used, but it's not something that causes white people to cringe, because it characterizes as other this group of people whom white people will welcome into our congregation as long as they want to come and worship the way white people do. Meaning the service can only last for an hour, and you'll stay in your pew and be quiet until you're told to sing a hymn or say a response. That's not going to work. And so the white church is going to have to engage in something that we've done, at least at a general conference level, with regard to Native Americans, Native peoples. We're going to have to be proactive in confessing the sin of racism, racialization, segregation, and all of it that is now visiting itself in the form of violence that is taking the lives of African American people. And the white church has to be the first to stand up. One anecdote, and then I'll let you move on to the next question. In what was really an unrelated situation, I happened to be, when I was a dean, in a meeting in Dallas at an institution called the Thanksgiving place. And primarily it was a gathering of Muslims, different ethnic constituencies of Muslims. I think I was one of only 3 non-Muslims in the room. It was a great conversation in which I was the observer, hearing the Muslims lament to one another about the ways that their pain, their suffering, their isolation are not being known in the rest of the community. And after about 10 minutes of this lament, one of the participants, an attorney, a Muslim, and a person of Turkish descent, stood up and reprimanded the other Muslims in the room. He said, "It's our fault. The problem is we only get together and have meetings like this and tell each other what we already know. We have to be courageous enough to go and tell the people who are different from us what we already know." And in the case of the white church has to be willing to go to the black community and say, what is it that I am refusing to know?
All right, Bill, thank you. We are running short on time, so I am going to combine 2 questions here to close us off, if that's okay. These questions both come from presidents of United Methodist institutions, and both of them are presidents who are very active in our network, and they are both raising interrelated, but I think quite important issues. So in the first question, the president asks, as a college president, it is essential that our leading donors and trustees see their role in our future. How do we make the case to become prophets with those who have power and whose interests may not always be served in speaking the truth? So that is the first question. And the second question, which is somewhat interrelated, the president here says that colleges' relationships to the church are sometimes limited to just the opportunity to speak once a year at general conference, but this doesn't seem sufficient to be able to communicate what is needed in terms of expanding our relationship. So the question becomes, how is it that a president can serve to help expand that relationship? So in this instance, we have two presidents thinking about differing groups, but thinking about how it is that they, in working with these two groups, can speak to the core issues of relationship between the church and the academy in particular ways that address those individual groupings.
Okay, the connection between the two is clear, but I'm going to try to address them in the order in which you raised them. The first one had to do with the matter of the prominent or leading donors, board members, trustee members, and how they see their future relationship with the college and the college with them. Obviously, those persons are important to the present and the future of the academy. My response is to suggest that those individuals be engaged not only in the mission, in conversations about the mission of the college, which has to be viewed not in the short term, but the long term. I understand that right now, the looming crisis for most campuses is how in the world are we going to get ready to have a fall semester in a way that people are going to be willing to send their kids to our colleges to pay the tuition at our colleges and universities, and not just turn the entire world into the University of Phoenix for the next academic year. I understand there is enormous pressure to deal with a short-term reality. But the first questioner, it seems to me, offers an invitation to emphasize the importance of thinking long-term with donors, with board members, and by thinking long-term, I mean to suggest it is tremendously important that the college think in terms of the kids who are possibly going to enroll in kindergarten in the fall. Where are their educational opportunities for the next 12 years going to lead them before they make a decision about college? What healthcare services are going to be available to them? What social networks and support systems are going to be available to them in their communities? How are they going to recreate? How are interracial, intergenerational, interethnic activities going to work? For the donor and the business person who's on the board, those individuals presumably have local customers, local constituents whom they're trying to serve in their businesses. They need future customers. They need, yes, customers in the fall in order to survive. They need customers 15 and 20 years from now, or their businesses won't be worth anything. So it is a shared and common interest to think long-term, to have a vision for something beyond even the campus 5-year plan, the 10 to 20-year plan. That's, it seems to me, takes the immediate pressure off and turns it in a different direction and says to the board member and the donor, come sit on the same side of the table as I'm on and let's look at the future together, long term. Now, to get to the second question, I completely agree with the questioner's comment that being limited to one brief set of remarks or one speech a year at an annual conference, let alone a general conference gathering, is inadequate. That is clearly true. It is clearly an insufficient amount of time. And the Academy has some resources that are available to take the initiative that doesn't wait for an invitation from the annual conference, but extends an invitation. One of the things that is really a creative possibility for us to emerge from this current crisis is a lot of us who never heard of Zoom are discovering its merits. And there are local church Sunday school classes and midweek groups, discussion groups, that are talking now about the bright and glorious days when we go back to the sanctuary and have church together and receive Holy Communion, but we don't want to give up our Wednesday evening Zoom groups. And they're going to still continue to do that because you don't have to wait for travel time from the office to the church building. You just start the discussion at 5 o'clock or whenever people are ready. The academy, the college, the university has the opportunity to extend hospitality. It can be hospitality to host events on campus, annual conference meetings, district meetings, local church meetings of various kinds. Don't have to be at the conference office or in the congregation sanctuary. They can be at the college. The resources of the college surpass anything that a congregation is going to have in the way of library, in the way of academic expertise. The college can exercise the hospitality by making a meal available on site and initiating conversations that can occur throughout the year, and can do that both in person on campus and digitally, Zooming or whatever electronic means are available. It really is going to be an opportunity for us to get beyond we're living in separate worlds. We have separate missional responsibilities. We don't know how to get together. Yes, we do. But we have to be creative and courageous in doing it. And finally, in the end, make sure the conversation is not about us as an academy, not about us as a congregation or conference. It's about the world. It's about the people who are dying in the streets. It's about the people who are suffering with COVID-19 and are not even being given the decency of being counted. It's for them that we are seeking the truth.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for this thoughtful presentation, for your willingness to take on these questions. I can tell you there were quite a number, as I suspected there would be, that we were not able to get to. And we will forward those questions to you, Bill. But thanks to everyone for being a part of this conversation. We hope that it is not the last on this topic, and I'm certain that it will not be. But we are grateful for the energy and the engagement surrounding this topic. We will have some upcoming webinars on other topics, and we will be alerting you to those in the coming weeks. And so thank you all for being a part of this. Again, thank you, Bill. And so we wish you all well, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thanks.